Hello and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran with episode 78 and we're well into season 2. In the last episode, we looked at the shattered landscape of the Deccan after 1565, the Battle of Rakasagi Tangadi or Talikota, and after that battle, the Aravidu dynasty tried to maintain a conversation with the vocabulary of empire from their seat in Penukonda, but the reality, a political looseness. The Aravidus could only provide their vassals, the ones who ran things in the provinces, with some sort of vague legitimacy, but they could no longer fully control the ground. This untethered freedom without authority was unsettling for all. No one would have felt the shift more acutely than the man who had spent 3 decades building the new economic engine for the empire on the Mysore plateau, Kempe Gowda. But before I settle into this episode, first as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group. This podcast is made possible because of their support. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. There is a stage between the existence of a strong empire like Vijayanagara under Krishnadevaraya and then the progressive erosion of it under weaker men that followed him. Krishnadeva was a builder. He understood the real politics. In many ways, he wrote that book. Quite literally, if you consider the Raya Vajakamu, a book that was written in his memory many years later, consisting of all his words. Following Krishnadeva were 2 kings, Achyuta and Aliyarama, and we can begin to sense the decline of the empire. These were clearly men who lacked the vision of empire, and they were quite content to square their elbows and enjoy the perks of office and find someone to blame for their failures to justify their paranoia. That actually describes Aliya more than Achyuta, but the inheritance of throne results in the successor either improving upon or destroying the legacy of his predecessor. There's never a condition of a king maintaining status quo, in the same manner that we can't expect a plant to neither grow nor wither. When the center collapsed in the hands of Aliyarama, who first imprisoned the rightful king Sadashivaraya, ruled in his name, and had upset the equilibrium of the empire to such a degree that he managed to unite all the warring sultanates against him. In their mutual hate against him, he invited their wrath upon the kingdom, the capital, and their people to very disastrous consequences. There had been constant wars between Vijayanagara and the sultanates in the past, but through all of that, Krishnadeva never once seemed to inspire anything short of respect from them, to the extent that they were sometimes friends, even while being perpetual enemies. Now one can believe that Aliya's brother Tirumala had even less of a legitimacy to the throne of Vijayanagara than Aliya himself. Yet, after the battle, he looted the capital, made off with an estimated £100 million worth of wealth, and then appointed himself king of what was left of Vijayanagara. Now, he was the front runner of the new Aravidu dynasty, the 4th empire of Vijayanagara. But he was a man less meritorious of that exalted status of the position of the king of Vijayanagara than any before him. And the proof of that? One doesn't need to look beyond an incident that occurred after he had re-established himself in Penukonda. After the battle, Tirumala faced an immediate and dangerous shortage of horses. The imperial cavalry had been decimated, and without horses, the truncated Vijayanagara state could not defend itself. The old lifeline, the Portuguese horse trade through Goa, had dried up after 1565, and there was really nowhere to turn to get a regular supply of horses. So Tirumala improvised. According to the accounts of Venetian traveller Cesare Federici, who spent years in Vijayanagara immediately after the battle, Tirumala made a grand announcement. Any merchant who brought horses to his court, even Vijayanagara horses captured in war and branded with the Vijayanagara's own mark, would be paid whatever price he demanded. Now, to make that offer stronger, Tirumala guaranteed the safe passage to and from Penukonda. The ploy worked. Portuguese horse traders arrived with large consignments of horses. Tirumala received them cordially, spoke generously, and waited until no more animals were forthcoming. Then suddenly his tone changed. The merchants were dismissed without payment. Federici records them leaving, desperate and, as it were, mad with sorrow and grief, to quote him. The consequences were lasting. Word got around and trust collapsed. The Goa horse trade with Vijayanagara never recovered, and Tirumala's reputation among Europeans at least was in the mud. In contrast, one would find it hard to imagine that Krishnadevaraya would behave so dishonorably. It, however, is not hard to imagine that, such being the measure of the man, he would not have commanded the respect of his people, of his vassals, the lofty Nayakas of Madurai, Tanjavur on the east coast and Ikeri on the west coast. It is not surprising that these Nayakas decided that they would not continue to remain vassals of the Aravidu house. The first to go were the Madurai Nayakas, who had operated with considerable independence ever since 1559. But after Talikota in 1565, they declared complete sovereignty, yet they continued to acknowledge the Aravidus in some sort of sparse manner. Closely following them between 1565 and 1567, Tanjavur and then Ikeri left the fold. The way we can piece together how much a strong king could command loyalty, and by contrast how disrespected a weak king could be, was illustrated by the Madurai Nayakas. When they began edging away from Vijayanagara, it wasn't because they believed that the empire had lost meaning, it's because they no longer trusted the people who ruled it. Even in the early 1550s, the Nayakas of Madurai had commissioned the text Raya Vachakamu, or the words of Krishnadevaraya. Now this was a work filled with reverence for Vijayanagara's past, especially for Krishnadeva. The Raya is presented as a model ruler, a source of order, a wise figure, and a figure worthy of loyalty. Madurai was already governing itself in practice, but it had not rejected the idea of the imperial authority of Vijayanagara. But it certainly rejected the leadership that followed Krishnadeva. So their decision to walk away was not ideological, it was administrative. Respect for Krishnadeva remained intact, even as confidence in his successors justifiably drained away. The last thing that the Madurai Nayakas chose to record was not an act of defiance, it was memory, a tribute. The departure of the Nayakas was significant. They were the cream of the feudal system, and they were next only to the empire itself. Their departure would have constituted body blows to any aspiring kingdom. But to one whose vision had been reduced to fatalism, and its rulers only interested in surviving in the role of very rich men, it would amount pretty much to petty men plundering their own treasury and demanding rather than commanding the loyalty of their vassals. They could only control what they owned directly. They could not command the provinces, and they could not assert any more imperial authority. Bengaluru was the last jewel in the Aravidu crown. Kempe Gowda had neither the authority nor the disposition to claim independence, so he continued to hold the city for Vijayanagara even as the gold on that crown had started to lose its sheen. And now for a commercial break, and when I come back I will explain the difference between the Nayakas and the Nada Prabhus and how each operated, and also the end of an era. We're coming up to the last few years of Hiriya Kempe Gowda. I'll be back right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi again. Sometimes the question is raised about why Kempe Gowda did not declare independence from the fractured Vijayanagara kingdom in the hands of an Aravidu dynasty with a fading reputation, just as the Nayakas had done. Well, the answer lies in his status in the pecking order of how an empire was run. The Nayakas could declare independence because they held the land that the empire recognized as theirs to rule. The authority came with title, revenue rights, armies, and jurisdiction. They were already standing on land that could be claimed as sovereign rights for themselves. Kempe Gowda stood on different ground. As a Nada Prabhu, he governed a Nadu, not a Rajya. His authority ran deep into tanks, roads, markets, and villages, but it didn't run wide. He did not hold territory in his own name. He administered it on behalf of the empire, on behalf of someone above him. The difference is how Vijayanagara was divided. At the top of the hierarchy were the Rajyas. Now these were large provincial units entrusted to Nayakas. Now these Nayakas held grants that gave them revenue rights over vast territories, command over armies, and the right to govern almost like kings in practice. Now below the Rajya were smaller divisions, the Mandalas, the Valanadus, and the Nadus. Now these were all clusters of villages or clusters of clusters that were organized for administration, tax collection, and for common things like irrigation. Below them, there were the Simes or the Stalas. And at the bottom of it, finally, there was the Grama, which was the village itself. Now each level had its own head who had some authority, but not everyone carried the title of empire. The higher one was in the hierarchy, like the level of the Raja or the Nayaka, the more the authority. Below them were lower in rung, either at the level of the Nadu or the village, and their authority was more marginal. It was more managerial. They had the power to run things, not the power to claim ownership over them. So Kempe Gowda's position sat firmly in that lower half of the ledger. As a Nada Prabhu, he controlled the Nadu of Yalahanka. He could repair tanks, mobilize labor, authorize markets, levy duties, and even get permission to build a fort. But he could not convert that administration into sovereignty without attracting the wrath of the empire and punishment, just as we were told that he did when he minted his own coins, however true that story was. Kempe Gowda was answerable to a Mahamandaleshwara, and that was a provincial governor appointed by the empire, and it was a federal post. Usually, there was a senior military commander who oversaw an entire Rajya. Orders, permissions, and confirmations flowed downwards through this chain. So while a Nayaka owned the Rajya, it was the Mahamandaleshwara who had federal oversight on that province. Just much like the present day, when you have a chief minister who actually runs the state, but you have a federal man above him called the governor who is there to oversee his actions. Now, Kempe Gowda's authority, therefore, was always mediated, and Bengaluru existed within that imperial accounting structure, not outside it. In other words, Bengaluru belonged to Vijayanagara, and now it belonged to the Aravidu dynasty. Now that is why post-1565, the break played out unevenly. The Nayakas of Madurai, Tanjavur and Ikkeri could walk away because they already held Rajas in their own right. All they needed to do was to harden those titles into crowns. Now Kempe Gowda could not do the same. He held the responsibility, but he held no sovereignty. Bengaluru, in the hands of Vijayanagara, needed Kempe Gowda to remain loyal, and because Kempe Gowda was that sort of man, he remained loyal. He didn't think that rebellion was unthinkable, but independence, he realized, was not legally his to claim, and it appears that he honored that commitment. Talikota happened in 1565 and Kempe Gowda died in 1569. In those 4 years, Kempe Gowda's reign was more of withdrawing from expansion and politics and turning instead to consolidation and piety. These were not the years of a founder trying to build a city, but an older ruler anchoring it in ritual. Sometime during his 5 years of imprisonment by Ali Ramaraya, Kempe Gowda is said to have taken a vow that after his release, he would build a temple at Gavipura. And today that temple is known as the Gavi Gangadeshwara temple. That temple was cut directly from rock and it stands apart from any of the earlier temples in the region. And its association with Kempe Gowda is consistent across all historical accounts and all local traditions. Around the same period, Kempe Gowda also sponsored the construction of a major Shaiva landmark to the south of the city, and that was the Basava temple at Basamgudi. We know it today by the name Bull Temple. Now that bull, the monumental Nandi, carved from a single granite outcrop, was a declaration of permanence. Now by the late 1560s, Bengaluru was no longer being marked by walls and markets and just the pete, but by huge religious monuments that were intended to last centuries, and they did. In his final years, Kempe Gowda also turned to matters of civic administration, and he oversaw the construction and improvement of the tanks that were serving the pete and the surrounding settlements. The Kempe tank and the Dharmabudhi tanks were two. Now these were not, again, ornamental works. They were really functional infrastructure, extending the city's capacity because he realized that the city needed to grow and it needed to sustain a growing population and trade. By the time Kempe Gowda died, and that was sometime around 1569, Bangalore could already boast of the marks of the last phase. The city was ringed not only by a fort, not only by markets, but by temples, tanks, and many ritual spaces that signaled the continuity of life there. His final legacy was not expansion. Kempe Gowda's final legacy was endurance. Now, by the time he died, Bengaluru was not a political capital in waiting. It had not been designated to compete with courts and dynasties and imperial centers, and that was not by omission. That was the choice. Right from the beginning, the city had been planned as a market town. It was orientated towards trade rather than proclamation of politics. The markets mattered more than its own lineage. The tanks mattered more than the titles that anybody could acquire for it. And the fort, it marked jurisdiction. It didn't mark ambition for growth. The Bengaluru existed to channel goods and labor and people across the plateau, and it didn't seek to politicize any of these things. Now that orientation did something very important in the years after 1565. As Vijayanagara weakened, and as the great Nayakas had broken away, cities built around their sovereignty were forced to choose sides. Capitals had to defend claims. Courts had to assert their legitimacy. Territories had to be renamed, retitled, refought over. But Bengaluru was spared much of that pressure precisely because it was not trying to become something else. It was a trade city, and trade cities survived differently. They survived by staying useful, by remaining legible to merchants, cultivators, carriers, even when political authority had become uncertain. Now this goes towards centuries of practice that even as wars raged across the Deccan plateau, the one thing that never got touched was trade. So, Bengaluru's value lay not in who ruled it, but what passed through it. And that made it less attractive as a prize and more resilient as a place. It is very clear that Kempe Gowda understood this truth, even if he never articulated it as some kind of policy. And how we know any of this is because all his actions appear to be inward-looking, not outward-looking in the manner of acquisitive kingdoms. He built temples, and temples were for the people who lived in that place. The tanks, expansion of them stabilized water supply, and markets regularized exchange. These were investments in continuity. They were not investments in dominance. And this is why Bengaluru did not lurch when authority changed hands. It just merely adjusted. So Immadi Kempe Gowda, or Kempe Gowda II, inherited a settlement whose main logic was economic. It was not political. So Bengaluru did not have to be reimagined by anyone. It needed to be kept running, and as long as trade continued to move through its streets without any kind of a grand spectacle, the city could continue to endure any kind of activity that happened above them. This was the alignment. That alignment would continue to influence his future far more decisively than any one single ruler could. And on this base that Kempe Gowda built, series after series of people would build upon that city, improve on it, and here we are today. When Kempe Gowda died, he left behind more than a city. He left behind a direction, and Bengaluru, almost by habit rather than design, continues to follow it. In the next episode, I will look at the death of Kempe Gowda, the discovery of his tomb in recent years, and the theories surrounding his resting place. The last memories of a founder of the city we live in, and that will come up in the next few days. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.